The ballroom glittered under 1,000 golden lights. Crystal chandeliers swung gently, their brilliance reflecting against polished marble floors. Guests moved with rehearsed elegance, their conversations a low hum of power and wealth. At the center of it all, a grand piano stood like a throne, polished black, gleaming, waiting. It wasn't simply an instrument. It was a stage for arrogance and spectacle. The billionaire host, a man whose empire was built not on compassion but conquest, tapped his glass to summon attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with a smug grin, "a little challenge for tonight. Whoever can play this piano like a true master." His eyes swept across the hall, pausing to relish the laughter bubbling up among his peers. "Will have won not just a song, but my daughter's hand." A ripple of gasps and chuckles followed. His daughter, seated beside him in a gown that sparkled like starlight, shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes lowered. She had no voice in this game, no choice in the charade. She was a prize, not a person. The crowd clapped in amusement, intoxicated by the man's audacity. In the corner, quietly arranging trays and sweeping crumbs, stood a janitor. His uniform was plain, his gloves worn, his presence nearly invisible. He was a black man, tall and lean, carrying the weight of decades that had taught him how to survive in rooms where he was seen but never acknowledged. His name, whispered rarely in this place, was Samuel. Samuel had been hired not for his mind, not for his soul, but for his ability to fade into the background. Yet even shadows carry memories, and Samuel's memory was filled with music. Before the world had turned cruel, before doors had been slammed in his face, he had been a boy at his mother's side, watching her hands dance across a battered church piano. Music was not luxury then, it was salvation. As the challenge began, wealthy suitors approached the piano. They played stiff, practiced pieces, stumbling through melodies meant to impress, but lacking soul. Their performances were met with polite applause, empty smiles, and the billionaire's mocking laughter. "Is that all?" he would say, shaking his head, sipping his wine as though he owned not just a piano, but the very air. The daughter's gaze wandered across the hall, restless, searching. And then, by chance, it fell on Samuel. He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the piano, his eyes heavy with something unspoken. She noticed the way his hands, even while holding a broom, flexed slightly as if aching for the keys. Something in her chest stirred, though she didn't dare speak. "Anyone else?" The billionaire mocked, his voice echoing. Surely among us, there must be a genius hidden in plain sight. The crowd laughed, their eyes turning like spotlights, until someone, a guest with more cruelty than wit, pointed toward Samuel. "What about the janitor? Let's see if he can play." A chorus of snickers erupted. Samuel froze. His broom felt heavy in his hands, heavier than the silence that followed. He wasn't supposed to be part of their world. He was supposed to clean, nod politely, and disappear. To step forward now was to risk not just ridicule, but exposure. The billionaire smirked. "Now that," he said, "would be amusing. Come, janitor, show us your talent. If you can play this piano, I'll marry you to my daughter." The room roared with laughter. The daughter's face burned with shame, her lips trembling as if she wanted to protest, but couldn't. Samuel's heart thundered in his chest. He knew the truth behind the laughter. To them, he wasn't a man, he was a joke. But inside Samuel, a voice rose. It was his mother's voice, soft and resolute. Asterisk, never let them decide your worth. The world will try to bury you, but music will lift you. Asterisk. He set the broom aside and walked slowly to the piano. The crowd jeered, whispering about the janitor's fantasy. Yet as Samuel sat on the bench, something shifted. His back straightened, his eyes sharpened, and his fingers hovered over the keys like a painter before a blank canvas. The first note struck, rich and deep. The room stilled. Another followed, then another, weaving into a melody that was not from sheet music or practice halls, but from lived experience. Samuel's hands moved with breathtaking precision, yet it wasn't perfection that captured them. It was soul. He played sorrow, each chord carrying the weight of years he had labored unseen. He played joy, hidden moments of laughter from childhood days when the world had not yet turned unkind. He played hope, the fragile but unyielding flame that had kept him alive through storms of rejection. His music spoke of chains broken, of prayers whispered, of dignity reclaimed. The guests who moments ago had laughed now sat in silence. Some shifted uncomfortably, as though the music was a mirror forcing them to see their own cruelty. Others leaned forward, breathless, caught in a spell they didn't understand. The billionaire's smirk faded. His wine glass paused midair, forgotten. He had expected chaos, clumsy banging, a spectacle to ridicule. Instead, Samuel had given them art that pierced the marrow of their bones. The daughter's eyes filled with tears. She watched Samuel not as a janitor, but as a man whose talent and dignity dwarfed the hollow arrogance of everyone in that room. She realized then that she was not powerless. For the first time, she whispered to herself, "I see him." The music swelled, then softened, drifting into a final note that lingered like a prayer in the air. Silence followed, vast and heavy. No one dared to clap, as though applause would break the sanctity of what they had just witnessed. Samuel stood. His chest rose with quiet strength. He did not bow, did not seek their approval. He simply looked at the piano one last time, as if to say, "This is who I am," and turned to leave, but the daughter rose abruptly, her voice trembling yet clear. "Father," she said, breaking the silence, "he has already won." The room gasped. The billionaire's face turned crimson, fury boiling in his eyes. He had set a trap for humiliation, not a stage for truth. And yet, before the power of music, his mockery had crumbled. Samuel paused at the doorway, his hand resting against the frame. The challenge had never been about marriage. It had been about dignity, about refusing to let laughter define him. And in that moment, he had reclaimed not just his worth, but the respect of a room that had once sought to erase him. Part 1 ends here, with Samuel standing at the threshold, the echoes of his music still haunting the air, and the question of what comes next burning in every heart that witnessed his triumph. The silence in the ballroom lingered like smoke after a fire. Samuel's music had left an imprint that words could not erase, and yet the air was thick with tension. The billionaire rose from his chair, his voice sharp, trembling not from fear but from rage. "This is absurd," he barked, slamming his glass onto the table. "A performance, nothing more. Do you think talent makes you worthy? Do you think a song erases who you are?" His words cut, laced with the venom of centuries-old prejudice. The crowd stirred, some nodding in cowardly agreement, others shifting uneasily as though their consciences weighed on them. The daughter's eyes, however, did not falter. She looked at Samuel, then at her father, and with a quiet steadiness said, "It is not the song that makes him worthy. It is the man." Her words hung in the air, fragile but undeniable. Samuel turned slowly, his eyes meeting hers. For years he had been unseen, yet now, in this moment, she saw him not as a servant, not as a shadow, but as a human being with dignity that no insult could strip away. The billionaire sneered. "You speak of dignity? He cleans floors. He is nothing in this world." His voice cracked under the weight of his own arrogance. But Samuel stepped forward, his presence calm yet unshakable. "I clean floors because you would not allow me to do more," Samuel said, his voice deep, steady, carrying across the hall. "But that does not define me. My worth is not determined by what you pay me to do, nor by the place you assign me in your world. My worth is mine, and tonight you've seen it, whether you wish to admit it or not." The crowd erupted into murmurs. Some avoided his gaze, ashamed. Others whispered about the audacity of a janitor daring to confront power. Yet there was a current running through the room, subtle but undeniable, a current of truth breaking through layers of mockery and prejudice. The daughter stepped closer to Samuel, her voice strong now. "Father, you turned my life into a wager. You mock not just him, but me, and tonight, the man you tried to humiliate has shown more grace, more courage, more soul than anyone here." Her words were rebellion, but they were also liberation. She had lived under her father's shadow, her choices dictated by wealth and appearances. Yet Samuel's music had awakened something she could not silence. The billionaire's fists clenched. He saw control slipping from his grasp, power unraveling under the simple force of truth. "You will not shame this family," he roared. But Samuel did not flinch. He had faced harsher storms in silence. Tonight, he chose to speak. "The shame," he said, "is not in playing music with heart. The shame is in mocking dignity, in treating your own daughter like a prize, and believing that money grants you the right to belittle others. That shame is yours, not mine." The word struck like thunder. The billionaire stood paralyzed, his empire of pride crumbling before eyes that could no longer pretend not to see. And then something unexpected happened. A single pair of hands clapped. It was hesitant at first, then stronger, until others joined in. The applause swelled, not for wealth or spectacle, but for truth, for resilience, for Samuel. Those who had laughed at him now clapped to cover their shame, while others clapped because they were moved, finally seeing what they had been blind to for too long. The billionaire tried to silence them, shouting for order, but the sound of applause drowned him out. His power, built on intimidation, could not compete with the strength of a man who had nothing to lose but his chains. Samuel bowed his head slightly, not as a servant, but as a man acknowledging the moment. Then he turned to leave, his steps steady. He had not come seeking approval, yet he left with something far greater, respect carved from truth. The daughter followed him, her gown trailing behind her like a declaration of choice. She caught up to him at the doorway. "Samuel," she said softly, "you do not know what you've given me tonight. You reminded me that I am not property, not a prize to be won, and you showed me what real courage looks like." He met her eyes, searching. There was sincerity there, but also the complexity of two worlds colliding. "You must choose your own path," Samuel said gently. "Not because of me, not because of your father, but because it is yours to claim." Tears welled in her eyes. For the first time in her life, she felt the freedom to imagine a life beyond her father's grip. And it was Samuel's defiance, his music, that had unlocked it. They stood there, two souls from different worlds bound by truth. Neither spoke of marriage, for that had never been the real prize. The prize was dignity, justice, and the courage to claim one's humanity. As Samuel stepped into night, the city light stretching endlessly before him, he carried with him not just a memory of the performance, but the knowledge that he had shifted something in that room. Perhaps only slightly, perhaps temporarily, but the seed was planted. Those who had mocked him would remember. Those who had doubted him would question. And the daughter, once silenced, would no longer bow to her father's cruelty. Samuel walked with quiet strength, his shadow long against the pavement. The world outside was still harsh, still unjust. But tonight, he had reminded them, and himself, that a man's worth cannot be dictated by uniform or station. It is carried in his soul, expressed in his art, and proven in his courage to stand unbowed before those who would diminish him. Back in the ballroom, the billionaire sat alone, surrounded by the hollow trappings of wealth. The laughter of his guests had faded, replaced by an unease he could not shake. His daughter's defiance echoed in his ears. Samuel's words burned his chest. For the first time, he tasted defeat, not from rivals in business, but from truth spoken by a man he had called nothing. The piano remained at the center of the hall, its keys still warm from Samuel's touch. It stood as a silent witness, a reminder that music, like dignity, cannot be owned or mocked into silence. Samuel's story did not end that night. For those who were present, it became legend, a tale whispered in hushed voices about the janitor, who played like a genius and silenced a room of power. For Samuel, it was not legend but life, a testament that no matter how invisible the world tried to make him, his light could not be dimmed. He returned to work the next morning, as he always did, but something had changed. Those who passed him in the hallways no longer looked through him. Some offered nods of respect. Others averted their eyes in shame. And though the world outside remained full of barriers, Samuel carried with him the unshakable truth. He was not what they named him. He was what he chose to be. And when his hands touched the keys again, whether in the quiet of church or the solitude of a small room, the music flowed as it always had, pure, unbroken, and free. It carried the story of a man who had faced humiliation and answered with brilliance, who had stood before mockery and answered with dignity, who had been called nothing and yet revealed himself to be everything they could never deny. For in the end, Samuel's triumph was not in winning a wager, nor in claiming the hand of the daughter. His triumph was in proving, to them and to himself, that his humanity was unshakable, his dignity untouchable, and his music eternal. The following week unfolded like a storm after stillness. Word of Samuel's performance spread beyond the gilded walls of that ballroom. At first, it moved in whispers among the city's elite. Guests struggling to reconcile what they had witnessed with the prejudice they carried. But whispers have a way of becoming echoes, and soon the story reached newspapers, then neighborhoods, then churches. They called him the janitor who played like a maestro. Some reports tried to twist the story, reducing Samuel to a curiosity, a spectacle, an oddity that broke the mold. Others, written by those who knew the long shadow of discrimination, told the truth. Samuel was a man of genius, hidden in plain sight by a society too blind to see him. Samuel himself did not chase the noise. He returned to his work quietly, refusing interviews, refusing to let his life become another performance for the same people who had once laughed at him. But no matter how hard he tried to move in silence, the world kept knocking on his door. One evening, while sweeping the hall after another event, Samuel heard footsteps. It was the daughter. She carried no diamonds, no gown, only a plain dress and a face unguarded by pretense. "Samuel," she said gently, "I know you don't want attention, but I need you to know what you did that night changed me." He nodded, offering a faint smile. Sometimes change comes from a song, but it's not the song itself. It's what people choose to do after they hear it. She hesitated, then asked, "And what will you choose?" The question lingered. Samuel had spent his life surviving, not choosing. His path had been drawn by rejection, by locked doors, by the world telling him what he could not be. Now, for the first time, he was being asked what he wanted. The answer did not come immediately. But as days passed, Samuel found himself at the old church where his mother once played. The piano that was out of tune, its would scar by time, but when his fingers touched the keys, it was as though he had returned home. Children from the neighborhood gathered to listen, their eyes wide, their spirits lifted by sounds they had never imagined could come from such a broken instrument. Samuel looked at those children and saw himself. Boys and girls told that they were less, told that their gifts had no place in the world. And he realized then that his music was not meant only for those who mocked him, but for those who needed hope. So Samuel began teaching. Quietly, humbly, without fanfare, he showed the children how to let their hands speak when words were too heavy. He taught them not just scales and notes, but how to play their stories, their joys, their struggles, their dreams. He told them, "Every note you play is a piece of your truth. Don't hide it. Don't shrink it. Let the world hear you." Meanwhile, the billionaire's household was in disarray. His daughter no longer obeyed his commands blindly. Her spirit, once subdued, had found its voice. She refused suitors chosen for her, refused to be bartered for wealth or power. And though her father thundered with anger, he could not extinguish the fire Samuel had sparked in her. In secret, she visited Samuel's church sessions, not as a benefactor but as a learner. She sat among the children, her jeweled name stripped away, her fingers fumbling over keys as she discovered music for the first time, not as performance, but as truth. And Samuel, with patience and quiet strength, guided her as he guided them all. One evening, she said to him, "My father wanted to make me a prize. You made me a person again." Samuel looked at her, the weight of her words heavy in the quiet room. "No one can give you back what was always yours," he said. "But if you believe in your own voice, no one can take it again." Their bond deepened, not in romance fashioned by spectacle, but in sheer defiance against the chains of expectation. She began to use her influence differently, speaking in rooms where Samuel's story had been twisted, reminding people that what mattered was not novelty, but dignity. The billionaire, seeing his grip on both his daughter and his reputation slipping, tried one last act of control. He summoned Samuel, offering him money, enough to leave quietly, enough to disappear from the city and the whispers that humiliated him. Samuel listened, his face unreadable. When the billionaire finished, Samuel said simply, "I will not take your money. I will not disappear so that you can forget. I am not your shame to erase." For once, The billionaire had no reply. Samuel's refusal was a mirror, forcing him to face the hollowness of his power. And so the story of Samuel did not end with a marriage or with riches. It grew instead into a legacy. The children he taught began to play with fire in their fingers, courage in their hearts. Some would go on to become musicians. Others would carry the discipline of music into lives as doctors, teachers, builders. But all of them carried Samuel's lesson. That dignity is not given. It is lived. Years later, when Samuel's hair had turned silver and his hands trembled slightly with age, he was invited to perform again. This time, it was not in a gilded ballroom of mockery, but in a crowded community hall, filled with faces that looked like his, voices that sang his name not as novelty, but as honor. He sat at the piano, the children he once taught now grown, surrounding him with gratitude. As his fingers pressed the keys, the music rose again, rich, defiant, free. It was the same truth he had played that night in the Billionaire's hall, but now it belonged to everyone in the room. And when the final note faded, there was no silence of shock, no hesitation. There was thunderous applause, not for spectacle, but for the man who had turned humiliation into triumph, invisibility into legacy. Samuel smiled softly, closing his eyes. His mother's voice returned once more. Asterisk, never let them decide your worth. Asterisk, he hadn't, and because he hadn't, generations after him would never forget the night the janitor played like a genius and changed everything. Time has a way of testing the strength of memory. For some, Samuel was still the janitor who played the piano, a story told at dinner tables as if it were fable. But for those who knew him, for the children he had guided, Samuel was something more, an anchor, a reminder that even in a world stacked against him, a man could stand unbowed. The church where Samuel taught music grew to be more than a classroom. It became a gathering place, a sanctuary for those searching for dignity in a society that denied them. Families came not only to hear the music, but to feel the spirit of belonging. Mothers brought their sons, fathers brought their daughters, and each week the sound of children learning piano spilled into the streets, reaching even those who never stepped inside. With time, Samuel's story reached activists, educators, and leaders across the city. They saw in him a symbol of what was too often overlooked. The genius buried beneath prejudice, the brilliance dismissed because of race or class. They invited him to speak, not just to play, but to tell his story. Samuel resisted at first. "I am no politician," he would say. "I am just a man who plays." But those around him urged him on. "You are proof," they told him, "that dignity survives mockery, that talent survives neglect. You're not just playing for yourself anymore. You are playing for all of us." And so Samuel began to speak. At community halls, at schools, at gatherings where young black children sat on folding chairs with wide eyes, he told them, "You are more than the names they give you. You are more than the jobs they assign you. You carry worth that cannot be taken. The world will laugh at you, but you must answer with your truth." His words spread as surely as his music, and with them grew a quiet movement. Neighbors helping neighbors, young people daring to dream beyond the roles society forced upon them. Samuel did not seek the spotlight, but the spotlight found him, because his story refused to die. Meanwhile, the billionaire who had once mocked him lived in decline. His empire, once unshakable, began to falter. Business rivals rose, scandals chipped away at his name, and his daughter, now a woman of her own standing, had broken free from his control. She worked alongside Samuel's community, donating her resources not to her father's legacy, but to the growth of the church school, ensuring children would always have instruments, always have teachers, always have a place to be heard. One evening, long after Samuel's legend had spread, the billionaire appeared at the church. He was older now, his arrogance weathered, his steps slower. The children whispered, recognizing the man who had once laughed at Samuel. He walked with a cane, but his pride still clung to him like armor. He entered quietly, watching Samuel guide a boy through a melody, correcting his fingers with patience. The music filled the room, not grand or showy, but alive. When the lesson ended, the billionaire approached. His voice was gravelly. "You've built something here." Samuel looked at him, neither warm nor cold. Something built on truth endures. The billionaire's eyes flickered, as if searching for the power he once wielded. "You humiliated me," he said. "You took what was mine." Samuel shook his head. "I took nothing. You humiliated yourself with your cruelty. I simply refuse to let your laughter define me." The billionaire trembled, his cane clattering against the wooden floor. "And now they talk about you, not me. You are the name they speak." Samuel sighed, his gaze steady. "Names fade. What matters is what we leave behind. You built walls. I built music. One imprisons, the other frees." The billionaire had no answer. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, Samuel spoke again, not in anger but with quiet finality. "Your daughter is free because she chose truth over your control. That is her legacy. Mine is this community. What will yours be when all that money is gone?" The billionaire stopped, his shoulders heavy. He did not reply, and perhaps there was no reply to give. He left the church with the weight of a man who finally understood he had built nothing that could outlive him. In contrast, Samuel's influence only deepened. His students began to carry his lessons into the world, performing on bigger stages, teaching in new schools, using their success to lift others. They spoke of him with reverence, not as a janitor, but as the man who showed them that the truest genius is not in dazzling an audience, but in daring to be oneself in a world that demands silence. Years passed. Samuel's hair turned white, his back bent slightly, but his spirit never dimmed. On his final birthday, the community gathered in the church, now renovated into a vibrant cultural center. Children, grown and new, played the piano for him, each note a thank you, each chord a continuation of his legacy. When they asked him to play one last time, Samuel placed his trembling hands on the keys. The melody that flowed was softer now, slowed by age, but it carried the same fire it always had. It was a song of survival, of defiance, of beauty born in struggle. As the last note rang out, the room erupted, not just in applause, but in tears and laughter, in the sound of community celebrating a man who had turned humiliation into hope. Samuel passed peacefully not long after, leaving behind no fortune, no mansion, no empire. Yet his name lived on in stories and music, in the countless lives he had touched. The city that once mocked him could no longer deny him. His life had become proof that dignity cannot be erased, that truth cannot be silenced, and that sometimes the greatest revolution begins with a single song. And so, long after the chandeliers of that gilded ballroom had dimmed, long after the billionaire's wealth had turned to dust, the story of Samuel, the janitor who played like a genius, continued to echo. It was told in churches, in schools, in homes where children sat at pianos and remembered that they, too, carried music in their souls. For Samuel's legacy was not only in what he played, but in what he inspired. A belief that no matter the mockery, no matter the chains, the spirit of a man who knows his worth cannot be broken.